I'm Richard Titus, managing partner of ARC. We're an advisory firm and a crypto hedge fund, which is a fancy way of saying we're a venture capitalist who manages our own liquidity. And I've been making investments and advising startups for longer than I could have possibly been alive at this point, because I like to think of myself as a really old 30-year-old instead of the 50 that I am.
30?
Yeah. And what's really interesting to me is each wave of innovation I've ever seen, there is this moment in time where the existing world doesn't embrace or even understand it. And the story I'll tell you is that when I started a company in my bedroom called Tag Media, or a web development agency, we got a government contract with NASA for $1 million, which turned into $10 million, and they sent us a $250,000 government check. We didn't have a bank account, so I went down to Wells Fargo to deposit this check, so I could pay my employees, and they wouldn't open a bank account. And they said, well, you have to have a business plan. I said, what do you mean a business plan? I've got a $250,000 check. And it literally, the bank manager had to be summoned from his lunch break to come and sit with us for 20 minutes, and he didn't know what the internet was. I'm pretty sure he thought we were drug dealers. But $250,000 was $250,000, so he did open the account, and he put a 30-day hold on the government check. And those of you who know about government checks, it's gold. That's like better than cash. And so what that really told me is that the systems we use to manage and control and secure payment and control and trust, these systems are the things that gate innovation and growth. And that's I kind of agree to come up here because I really think it's important, whatever we think about the underlying services and products that happen on a network or a system, we need to embrace all of humanity's needs and desires. And so I'm interested in sort of hearing at a higher level, and less about the tactics of sort of how Intimate Coin is going to work, but why you did this, what drove this to start, and then sort of go in. So do you guys want to talk about that?
Do you want to start, Rubes?
Yeah, I mean, I can start just in a 5-minute presentation I gave sort of half an hour ago. For me, it was from initially building an application where you could book escorts on demand, and basically seeing the struggles that exist for people within that industry to transact through institutional buyers. So basically whether to get accounts, to have legal help, to have help from the police or authorities if required, even in areas where it was illegal, because of that personal reputational risk, people were not able to transact as safely or as freely as they would otherwise. So that was kind of the initial starting point. I mean, just by way of example, the way that a sex worker, even in a legal jurisdiction, interacts with a client, they verify the sound of their voice or the tone of their text message. That's it, because no client's going to provide their ID, and there's no kind of middle ground. So that is archaic when you look at what exists with systems right now where you get in someone else's car or stay in someone else's hotel room. They exist for these other industries, but the adult industry was neglected. So for me, it was just a case of seeing a massive inefficiency and a very unfair one that could be quite easily solved with technology.
For you, what brought you to this company? What made you really excited? I'm sure you've answered this like 100 times, so.
I have, but I never tire of answering these questions. I think there's two things. Firstly, it was just the pure business case. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you actually remove the term adult from this industry, it's an incredibly underserved market. And I actually became enamored with blockchain by looking at developing economies and applications around how you could actually emancipate the poorest of the poor and empower them. But it was a really futuristic use case as well. And I thought with blockchain, you kind of need an immediate use case where you can prove the technology and show how it can work today. And it wasn't until I met Ruben, who started educating me about the adult industry, that I saw not only is there a huge business case here for a market that is already massive. I mean, I think the conservative figure for internet traffic is it's around 30 to 35% of all web traffic goes to porn. And the adult content industry is valued at around $800 billion. Sorry, not adult content, but this is all content. So movies, TV, music, porn, everything combined, it's around $800 billion. But the slice of the pie for porn, despite the web traffic, is minuscule.
Right.
And this is because payments are broken and people don't want to touch this industry. And it wasn't that long ago that people said they wouldn't pay to download music. Mm-hmm. But then iTunes made it very easy for people to be able to purchase what they wanted selectively and seamlessly and inexpensively. And suddenly you've got a massive market where none of us think anything about spending $12 or $13 a month on a subscription to Spotify. So no one's done this for adult content. So the business case was one thing, but for me, I'm really driven by social impact initiatives, and I saw that within the adult industry, it's a place where people are marginalised, stigmatised, and socially excluded for their work, whether they're sex workers or designers and manufacturers of pleasure products or even educators within the adult industry. And I thought, this is actually ridiculous.
Right.
There's very few activities that every single one of us will experience so intimately within all of our lives than sex, and yet this industry is taboo within our own lives. It makes no sense. So I saw an opportunity to be able to change this.
So there's some interesting parallels and analogs between the panel we just saw and the sort of vilification of the token sale and crypto industry in general, and sort of sex work and adult products and services, which is, by the way, a very large group of businesses which are all sort of painted with the least attractive of the paints. Talk a little about that. Like, how does it feel to be in a business where sometimes conferences won't take your money, or where you sort of get put in the sort of the back of the closet in the room, sort of, talk about that, how that is, and what any experiences you've had around that.
I mean, it's to be honest with you, initially, once I got past the initial kind of acceptance of the business model I was working with and started talking to people about it, I've been overwhelmed, particularly in the startup communities and the business communities, how kind of how willing and supportive people have been, I guess, of the industry. And the other thing is, it really is looking at a competitive advantage. Like the things that we're doing now, that the markets are so massive, and people aren't doing what we're doing because of these exact barriers.
Right.
So the things that are a barrier for us and that we're able to overcome is exactly our competitive advantage. It is frustrating at times, and occasionally something will happen kind of, either someone has a particular view or someone will walk away from you or not want to continue a conversation that can be kind of, I guess, a little bit confronting again, but overall, most people now are pretty happy to sort of talk about these things. I mean, 5-10 years ago, if you met someone online dating, you'd pretend you met at a pub or through friends, right? Now, everyone's got Tinder, Blinder, Grindr, Happen out, and it's like people now acknowledge we all like sex and probably want to have it. So that next conversation around there's an industry around this is nowhere near as hard as it was to have a few years ago. But just quickly, the other point on that was when we started Rendezvous, the on-demand escort application, blockchain made perfect sense. But like you said, both industries had huge stigma and UX issues, and that's massively changed over the last 2 years, mostly because people are now going, this isn't going to get shut down by the banks, this isn't going to get shut down by regulators, this is going up in value, I want a real use case, how do I make money? So it's kind of seeing that flip, and being able to utilize that to bring this money in and actually sort of use it within this industry is great timing.
That's great. And let's talk a little about how this industry drives innovation. You and I have had that conversation before, actually. I mean, a story from my own history is when we were at Razorfish's the very first early IAB meetings, we actually were looking at adult content for leadership on advertising because they were way better at it than we were. Like we were like, look at this, like pop unders, pop overs, data, all profiling. I mean, some of the best data scientists I've ever worked with have come from the adult business. Where do you see innovation coming from? Like, where do you see that being fed? And we can go back to your thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think there's a real need and there's real demand in this industry.
Right.
And people want it immediately. I think for me, the biggest opportunity now, I mean, obviously in the history, adult has been driving things like the adoption of everything from web streaming to VHS to virtual reality porn. At the moment, the biggest opportunity in adult and the biggest need is this trade-off between the consumer's desire to transact privately and the need for a service provider to assess reputation and safety through disclosure of data. So you've got this weird dichotomy of people who can't transact together because they want different things and the same thing at the same time. Cryptocurrency provides this solution where people can actually build pseudonymous profiles and share data through voluntary disclosure if and when it's requested and when they choose to do it.
And with one person.
Exactly. And I think that's really exciting because this it's not just a channel, it's not just a medium. this innovation has the power to completely transform the way that we view the industry and how we interact with other people. And I think that's very exciting because our definition of the industry is very broad. You know, it's important to define here that we're not just talking about sex work, we're not just talking about live cam platforms or even hardcore pornography that you don't want, you know, your wife to see that it's going to show up on your credit card bill that you paid for it. We're talking here about even sex educators. We work with a 24-year-old young female entrepreneur who is a designer of emoji-themed vibrators, and she's currently using her personal bank account to run her business. You know, this pseudonymous need to be able to transact on networks is widespread, and it has the opportunity to completely open up this space and allow new people to actually access it. So we really believe that that's going to open up new revenue streams, fix the issue of profit leakage, and just simply afford people the right to data privacy while doing what they love.
So what do we do about, and I think that's a really important point, right? Like cryptocurrency, the blockchain are not anonymous, they're pseudonymous. And the power of this is the ability to transact more safely than a bag of cash, which can be stolen or taken any time. You have no history, like no transactional record, nothing. And yet at the same time allowing you to preserve your anonymity to share only with those people you want to share with. I think this is the power of the internet, it's the power of community. You know, you could have new communities. I was a member of something called Suicide Girls, my friend's the founder. And that actually was one of the tightest, most wonderful communities I've ever been in, which is funny because like the theme of it was not one that you would think would drive a really close-knit community, but it did because of that trust factor that existed in that community.
It's actually really interesting with looking at quite a lot of, you have people's perception of what adult and you know, a lot of those communities are like. But when you actually deal with these people, so many of them are super inclusive. They are, you know, as an industry, a little bit hard to get to know because they're sick of people treating them a certain way. But when you get in there and show them that you actually genuinely care and you want to drive a really positive conversation, they're so incredibly inclusive. And things like, you know, swinging and BDSM have amazing communication between people. Yeah. They're very upfront about what's happening, how it's going to roll out, and things like that. I actually think a general, you know, there's a lot that could be learned from the adult industry that, you know, the general public could and probably should start to implement, you know, around consent and communication and things like that. It's an amazing industry full of really kind-hearted people.
Someone the other day said to me that the blockchain and smart contracts are trust and consent captured in software, which I think is a really interesting.
Is it Miko?
Well, it wasn't actually, but it should have been.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure. I feel like I'm about to really regret that answer.
You should be nervous. You want to talk today about challenging investment classes, and I don't know if it's just because I'm a female founder or because I am the Chief Impact Officer, so people want to know how I position myself in terms of social impact to what a lot of people think is a shady industry. But people often ask me about how intimate is going to prevent things like
That's where
human
I was going
trafficking.
next. Yeah, that's exactly where I was going next. I mean, like, so look, I think that most Americans are pretty comfortable with Playboy magazine and Penthouse and sort of that erotica exists, and 50 Shades of Grey volume 15 is now out on the shelves, and you know, we've sort of embraced the fact that these things happen, and we're still titillated by it, but you know, at least we understand it exists and can be on the bookshelf at Walgreens. But this issue is a very real issue. Like, people are trafficked, there are people who are victimized. How do you balance that, and how do you manage that? Because, you know, to be a facilitator of that, I mean, you know, Craigslist, Backpage, lots of these businesses that made lots and lots of money for lots of people, some of the founders are in jail now.
Yeah, they are. I think there's two issues here. So firstly, I just want to address the problem that a lot of people see the sex industry as completely homogenous from end to end.
Right.
Currently, there is no framework for us to be able to distinguish between good and bad actors on the network. And the problem is that legal tax-paying entities, no matter what type of work they're doing, whether they're a sex worker or they've just launched an app to help women track their reproductive health, they are chucked in the sex bucket by banks and other financial institutions. Now, this creates a really murky environment which doesn't allow us to identify who are the good actors on the network, because contributing citizens to society are regarded as outlaws. So this is a real problem. We need to be able to create a framework to do this, and this is something that we're leading the way in terms of our protocols. so that we can actually help people go beyond just the framework of legality and illegality, because that's not enough. We advocate for the decriminalisation of sex work, because the moment you criminalise certain activities, you force them to operate within the shadows, and they end up being coupled with criminal activities.
So your view is with the intimate token and with good background checks and with transparency, you would actually have less of the sort of less attractive parts of the business.
So let me be clear. Criminals will prefer to operate with monetary systems that provide complete anonymity. So cash is the preferred system. They otherwise might use Bitcoin or Monero or Zcash. Intimate is defined by its trust and reputation system,
Right.
which is, it's developed. We've actually got our blockchain analyst, Sebastiano, in the audience, so if anyone would like to go into technical detail later, he is the author of our trust and reputation system and the person to speak to. But this is what defines what we're trying to achieve here. It's the first time that anyone has ever provided reward and incentive and recognition for people who are good actors within an industry that is constantly seen as dirty. It's not dirty. It's a great business opportunity.
It's the oldest profession in the world.
It is, and it touches every single one of our lives. And at the moment, it's completely, it's open for innovation and disruption, because we're not seeing diversity in the space, because the barriers to entry for new entrepreneurs are too high. We want to level the playing field, remove the stigma, and allow it to be a safe space for all.
And you guys are going to have an oracle function within the product, right? I mean, there is sort of a backdoor or a safety. I mean, because you do need, in some ways, a centralized sort of ability to stop bad actors, correct?
So I mean, there's two things there. There's having the oracles, which can provide additional attributes which people can use. Effectively, when two people operate within the system, they can choose what information they need to know about the other. So if you wanted to go in there with zero rep, interact with someone with zero rep, you're free to do that. Which potentially means that there could be bad actors operating in that situation. What we do is we have the ability to censor transactions.
Right.
So it's still immutable. Every transaction is still proven, but there is the ability to censor transactions, which is, from the work that we've done and the people we've spoken to and the design we've come up to, it's basically unavoidable if we want to be able to ensure these things aren't happening in the system.
Right. Cool. Anything else you guys want to say before we wind down?
Are we allowed to sing to the music? Because we like to do that sometimes.
Can we change the track?
I think I will say is every investment I've ever made that really outperformed, including my Tesla investment, which really was the most ill-advised investment I've ever made in my life. It was to a guy who was in the middle of a divorce and had no money, and was about to run out of cash on a car that was broken down. Like, literally, this is the worst investment ever, and it's a very, very good performing one. So what I would say is that often it's the investments and the opportunities at the edge of an ecosystem or the edge of a new idea that really transform industries. And I think you guys are doing something really interesting, and I'm really proud of you guys for pushing on.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Richard.
Cheers.